Hello, class, and welcome to our chapter on interfaces. Let's get started. First thing that's important to keep in consideration, keep in their mind, is that you should not be expecting your users to know anything. Right? You need to make your user interface needs to be completely friendly for the first timer. All right, not just the core gamers or longtime veterans and whatnot. Because as soon as you start assuming any knowledge from your potential players, then you're probably just going to make some mistakes from that point on. So don't assume that they know anything. Don't assume that they've played all the Call of Duty games or anything, and you're going to make your interface similar to that or resemble that in some way. Just assume that your players have never played a game at all, and try to be convenient for them. If it's convenient for them, it's convenient for everyone. Okay? So that is the first and foremost thing to do. Okay, a little example that I have down here. Try and use obvious kind of things. Don't just say press the B button. Show a picture of the B button when you do it. Right? I'm sure you've seen that a million times, right? There's a reason for that, because especially new players, they don't know which button is which. They have to look, and if you give them visual representation of it, then they're going to find it almost immediately, and then go ahead and push it. Especially with today's buttons, they're color coded. Well, actually, they're not color coded anymore as much as they used to be, but they were really bright. Now they're getting a little bit more just labeled. But anyway, so who is your player? We just said, I just said you have to treat your player as if they're going to be the first timer. But depending on your game, most of your players, obviously, they're not going to be first timers. If you're making an FPS or something, you're going to have some first timers, but most of them are not going to be, right? Some players are going to be long time veterans. Some players are going to be new, and most of them are going to be probably somewhere in the middle. But regardless of their previous experience with other games, when they first come to your game, they're going to be new to your game. And so your interface needs to guide them to be able to do whatever it is that your game needs to be able to do. So if your game is really heavy on certain button combinations, your interface needs to guide the player to be able to do that, and kind of step by step, so tutorial type stuff. Right? Next, right, we have different type of interfaces to be mindful of. So it's not just on-screen stuff. It's not just the controller, because the controller is going to be different on different devices. So if your game is an arcade game, or if it has an arcade port to it, you may very well have a customized control scheme with those cool buttons that we like from the arcades, or even an actual gun of some kind if it's a shooter, or maybe it's a dance platform, or a little mallet for hammering things. Whatever the case is, arcade games have fully customized controls, or they can have fully customized controls. They don't necessarily need it. If you're playing, if your game is like a new Pac-Man style game, the regular knob and few buttons is going to be fine. That's pretty standard, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be anything if it's an arcade. And then going through the other type of consoles, PC, everybody's going to have a mouse and keyboard. But I don't know if you've ever tried to play Dark Souls with a mouse and keyboard. There are people out there that do it. It's not recommended. Right? It's recommended to get an Xbox controller or a Logitech controller of some kind, connect that to your computer, and play your games with an actual controller. That's not true of all games. Right? Some games it's recommended to use a mouse and keyboard. Some games it's not. Okay, so you can assume that everybody on a PC has a mouse and keyboard, or at least they have a keyboard and a touchpad if they're on a laptop. So you're not positive which type of mouse they have. If they're gaming, they probably have a real mouse though, and they're not trying to game with a touchpad. If you're making a mobile game, nobody's going to have a keyboard. They're only going to have the screen. They're not going to have a controller of any kind, just a touch screen. And so your controls have to be usable on the touch screen. Your fingers, your thumbs are going to be the only thing that you can push. Nobody's really reaching around their fingers. Maybe 5 people are. I don't know. But they're going to have to be on the screen. There's no tactile feedback on the touch screen. So that's a disadvantage for that. And of course, as we all know, when you're touching the screen, you're blocking portions of the screen. So now your user interface is blocking another part of the user interface. So that's definitely something to be aware of. Next, we go to the console. Everybody's very familiar with that. You're going to have whatever controller is the default for your console. There are a few peripherals. There's a few third-party controllers that somebody may have. And if that's what they have, then that's up to them. Maybe they get an advantage from it. Maybe they have a disadvantage depending on which third-party controller or peripherals they're trying to use. But you can't plan for those. You have to plan for the default controllers that come with that console. That's the one that you have to assume that everybody has, and pretty much everybody is going to have at least one of those. Very few people are that one guy who played Dark Souls with a Guitar Hero guitar. And not too many people like the N64 controller. That's my bad controller example. Which hand do you hold in which thing? You hold it differently for different games. It's never convenient. You can never reach the D-pad and the toggle at the same time. It's just weird. Visual interfaces. Okay, this is going to be very different for different consoles in that. So like mobile games, the visual interface, like we just mentioned, the controller is the visual interface. So they're overlapping each other. They're getting in each other's ways. Hopefully, they're not getting in each other's way too much, but they are. You have to be aware of that. The menu system and the HUD that I have on here, that's the active and the passive. So the active is the menu system. The users are clicking through the menu. They're engaging in the menu when they're using the menu. They have, if they're on a keyboard, if they're on a computer with a keyboard and a mouse, maybe they are actively moving around and clicking on things. If they're using a controller, then they have to navigate with the controller, up, down, left, right, shoulder buttons, whatnot. Good example of controller navigation is, think of Skyrim. You open up the menu, and then you have the up, down, left, right, and from each of those you go into another main submenus, and it's very much up, down, left, right, B, A, and that's pretty much it. The simpler the navigation of the menu is, the better the players are going to be able to use it. If the navigation menu is confusing, then that adds to the difficulty. So Dark Souls 1 menu system, while you're playing, some people are very good at it. They can actually navigate the menu while playing the game at the same time. I've tried it. I can't do it. It's possible because for a large part of it, they're using different buttons. You're using the D-pad to navigate the menu, and you're using the thumb toggle to walk around. You're not going to be activating things the same way because you are technically in the menus, so your character's not going to be picking up items or whatnot, but people do it. So they take advantage of the different button combinations that are in the menu versus when somebody is normally playing the game. So the D-pad is not used in that game, but it is used in the menu, and so somebody can do both if they put the effort into actually learning it. And then so the passive on-screen the passive on-screen interface is the HUD, the heads-up display, originally used for fighter planes in that, so that the pilots can see the navigation stuff without having to look away from what's actually in front of them, which is important for their life, right? So video games are the same way, right? The HUD stuff, this stuff is very important. While you're playing the game, you need to be able to see it without being distracted, without taking away from actually playing the game, because that's your in-game life. So things that should be in the HUD are the necessities that somebody would want to or need to see while they're playing. The HUD should not take up too much of the screen real estate. It should have as much as is needed and no more and no less. That's the ideal HUD, right? Moving on to platform-specific items of the visual interface. So on arcade games, there's not going to be too much visual interface stuff. Arcade games are played quickly. There's a high turnaround. People are not spending all day in one arcade game. Not these days, right? So simple navigation of any visual interface on arcade games. There are some games where you just have a steering wheel, and so you just turn the wheel left and right to navigate. Press the gas button to select. That's it. That's all you got. So you got to make it as simple as possible. On the console would be probably the next most complex type of interface style, because they do have controllers, but again, they only have up, down, left, right. Maybe shoulder buttons can be incorporated. That's an A and B for select and back. If you make it more complicated than that, it's not going to be a good idea. But again, the players, because they have this console, not like in the arcades, where they're not spending tons of time on the console. They have it in their home. They're very used to the controller, or at least they will be after a few hours of owning the thing. They're going to get very used to it. So you can assume that the player doesn't have to look down at their buttons, at least not after the first few minutes. They'll figure that out. They'll play around with your game, or they've played some other game in the past, so they know where the buttons are. They know up, down, left, right, A and B. You can trust that they know that, and that's pretty sufficient. PC menus can get very complex. Now you're talking about incorporating drop-down boxes and radio buttons and select check boxes and all that kind of stuff. You open up the menu and there's all kinds of stuff on there because there's a mouse now. You can even have text boxes where people type in their names very easily. On the console, when somebody has to type in their names, you've got to open up. Ideally, you're going to open up the console-specific menu, and it's going to have the little on-screen keyboard and the text box in there, and they're going to move around. If it's a PS4, it's a little easier to navigate that one because they can use the thumb pad, and they can move it around as if they had a touchpad from a mouse. That's really cool. But still, they don't have a keyboard, so the typing is going to be a lot slower than a regular keyboard. Like people on the PC are going to have a full keyboard. Once they open up the menu, you could give them a spreadsheet and they'll figure it out real quickly. Next is the touchscreens, right? You have almost the same capability as you do on a PC, except now you have big fingers and small buttons to worry about. So don't make small buttons, because big finger people are going to hate your game if you do. Other than that, it's pretty much similar to the PC as far as things that you can put in there. You can still have drop-down boxes and check boxes and radio buttons and all that. In games, people are not zooming. They're not doing that two-finger zoom because it is a game. but you can have the built-in options for those kind of things like radio buttons and checkboxes and that kind of thing. That can be, if it's an Android game, you can use the Android-specific ones. You can have this big select thing, and when they tap on it, that now pops up, and you're not necessarily building menus inside of menus. It's platform independent. Its platform is built into it, so you're good on there. Online games, which I haven't mentioned until now, they're going to be very similar to PC games. Of course, it's if it's a web-based game, you absolutely have to give the player some option to save. Some of these will save automatically, like the Facebook games that people used to play. Less people are playing any of them nowadays, but they still do exist. They would often save on pretty much every click. That's pretty standard, but that does change the flow of that game and that. A lot of asynchronous commands in that. So asynchronous commands is the way that you work the web. You fire off a function, and you're not necessarily holding up, waiting for the result to come back. When the result finally comes back, then you can handle it. And that way the player can continue playing, thinking, doing whatever it is that they're doing, and they're not just waiting for a frozen game. And those are some things to think about for web, not online as in console, but like a web-based game. Next, normally we will be going up to the board and drawing a HUD. Instead, I'm going to use these examples right here and just kind of talk about the things that should be in a HUD, things that are important. So obviously player health is super important. If there is health in your game, the player needs to know how much health they have. It doesn't, depending on your game, it doesn't necessarily have to be a growing health bar. It can just be like a 0 to 100% kind of thing, or red, yellow, and green type of thing. Same thing for mana. If your game uses something along those lines, you need a bar so they know how much they got, so they know how active they can be at any moment in the game. If it's a shooting game and it does have ammo, that's an important thing because that's a usable resource for those type of game. Same thing with the amount of lives that a person would have, or any other resource that needs to be actively used all the time. So if it's a RTS game, you may want to have the main currency, how many logs or bricks or what have you. If there's a lot of different currencies, then you don't want to include all that into the HUD because it's just going to clog up your HUD. But if there's one or two main forms of currencies, then go ahead and put those in the HUD. Players are going to be concerned with how much currency they have at any given time because they want to build that next thing. If your game has a score, like these old-fashioned games always used to have a score, the score would often be right there into the HUD, and they didn't have nearly as advanced HUDs usually as we do now. So this is Fallout New Vegas with more things in the HUD. It actually takes up less room than this Gradius. So Gradius has power-up options. As you're picking up items here, it will highlight the next item along the list, and the player presses a certain button, they'll gain that power-up. And then you have how many lives you have, the current score of the player, and then the high score, which in this case is the same as the current score. The player has beaten the high score so far. In the first level, too, that is. So, must be a new game. In the Fallout New Vegas example, we have just an icon that says the player is currently saving. So that's a very good thing to have. They remind the player that the game does save periodically, and remind the player when the last time the game has saved, because people do like to save their games often. And it's not part of the game itself, but it does change what the player's decision making is. Have I saved in a while? No. I'm going to save before I do this. Or, oh, it quick saves all the time. I saw the thing 5 minutes ago. I'm just going to continue playing the game. I'm more immersive that way because I've seen it. It doesn't take up a lot of the screen, but now they don't have to think about saving quite as much because it's showing up there all the time. So that's actually a very good little icon that shows up there and keeps the players engaged in the game versus thinking about administrative type things about the game. Then in the bottom corner here, they have their health and that's a compass down there, I believe, right? Yeah, that's the game's compass. So not the mini map, although a lot of games will have a mini map. They have the compass down here. Other ones will have the compass up at the top center. Perfectly fine in either case. The top center is probably the more popular version. And then bottom right hand side is very common for ammo for shooting games and what type of weapon you have. And even the health of that weapon can be down there. Mostly, as we've noticed, hopefully you've noticed in here, mostly we're going to get the four corners of the screen. That's where HUD items tend to exist the most of the time. Following that will be all the way across the bottom and potentially all the way across the top. We don't put HUD things along the sides too often, but certainly that's not unheard of. You put things along the side. Really, the only HUD thing that goes in the middle should be a crosshair, if that fits into your game, or a cursor of some kind, if that is what fits into your game. But don't put much else or nothing else into the middle. The next thing that may go in the middle is enemy stats. So if you're navigating along and there's an enemy, 5 enemies right in front of you, and you have your crosshair there, whichever enemy the crosshairs appear on, enemy stats can pop up there. That's a HUD element. It gives the player the perception that it's way off in the distance wherever the enemy is, but it's a HUD element, and that absolutely can be in the middle. That's one of the few things that you can put in the middle and doesn't distract the player from the game, because that's the information that they want to be right there, right where that enemy character is. All right. Moving on to so next I usually build a few different types of menu systems. So a character choosing menu system. So think Skyrim or really any other game that you're building, either building a character or equipping a character once you've already begun the game. So some of the things that we can think of in the character equipment, if you have a 3D map of the character, and that's usually off to one side, and then all the slots for equipment stuff that the character can wear would be off on the other side. Maybe a helmet, shoulder pads, armor, gloves, pants, boots, weapon, potentially multiple weapons, perhaps a necklace or rings if it's a game that has necklaces or rings, glasses, maybe even. Whatever the equipment stuff is, some sort of way to see that. It's very common to have all those things just arranged in kind of a skeleton shape. So the helmet up in here, chest stuff over here, weapon on either side, left-handed and right-handed weapon, their pants down below and their boots down at the bottom. That's very common. Another way to do it is just have a list of areas, and you can click on that list and then it expands to the next part of the list. So that's actually how Skyrim does it. When you go into the menu, the list of armor will show up, and then you just go through and you tick off which armors you're going to put on. So it's actually not specific to the body part, whether it's the chest or the pants or whatever that go on there, or the boots. But you have the whole thing. So here's all the armor stuff, and then here's all the weapons that you can click onto, and then you just click on a sword, and you click on a shield, and it'll go in the. No, it won't go in the right hands. You have to tell it in the correct hands. Most games now are going to be right-handed characters. There are some games that you can put the weapon in the left hand and the shield in the right hand, and it will play identically. That's a game choice. Not every game is that way. Dark Souls, for example, is not that way. If you put whatever you put in your left hand, that's going to be your shield hand. If you put a weapon in there, you can attack with that weapon, but then some weapons actually have special moves that they do because they can parry or something. And the same thing if you were to put a shield in your right hand, now all of a sudden you're going to start attacking with your shield. So that's the kind of the character gearing menus that we put in there. We kind of take away some of the other stuff. We might put things that we might put as like armor ratings if it's the armor area. So you're putting new armors on, and you might have somewhere, maybe at the bottom of the screen or up where the character is. If the character is displayed on one side and the equipment is on the other side, you'll show the armor rating on there so that when the players are changing the armors, they can see what's good, maybe what protects against fire and what protects against poison and whatnot, or what just protects against raw damage. So multiple armor ratings, perhaps. Next, an inventory menu type. The way that you navigate the inventory, hopefully, if you're doing a good job, hopefully the way you navigate the inventory is very similar, very easy to adjust between the inventory and the character equipment. So think Skyrim. It's the same menu. Right? There's no difference. You go into the inventory menu and you press the R button and you equip that inventory item to the right hand of your character. So there's not even a difference there. Other games will do, when you're in the character equipment menu, you pick on the body part that you want to equip something onto, and then that opens up the inventory menu, possibly even categorized down into only armor things that fit in that spot. And then it looks like it's the normal inventory menu. Okay, so those two things are going to be very close to each other. They need to work in harmony because if you have two completely different menus for those things, players are going to go, why? Why are they different? Why, when I go to my inventory, it looks this way, but when I go to actually put gear on, it looks a different way? Why don't they look the same? Use one for the other. Okay. Skyrim's doing it, and even the other games that have the little player body grid on there, they're doing it as well. Okay. It makes sense. The main menu of the game is going to be possibly completely different than every other menu. Classically, the main menu had the logo and press start. And then you would select one player, two player, option A, option B, options, what have you. And that was the main menu. Now the main menu is load game, create new game, turn mods on and off, or quit, or system settings. Those are the kind of thing in main menu. And once a player selects any one of those, if it's system settings, now you're in a settings menu. All right, they're pretty straightforward. You just want to make them look whatever the look and feel of your game is, right? Bear in mind that all these things have to be red. So if you're playing even a dark game, the menu still has to be red. Okay, so keep that in mind. Racing game. The HUD in a racing game, you're going to want all the necessities of racing. So the speed that you're going, maybe a mini-map that would depend on whether or not your game has a mini-map, right? Maybe a rear-view mirror, maybe how many power-ups you have or what power-ups you have. So, and that's not just like a Mario Kart power-ups, but maybe turbo boost power-ups or what have you. So all those kind of things, you should know what belongs in a racing game HUD, right? How much money you have to buy stuff after the next race that doesn't go in the HUD. What kind of stuff, what kind of brakes you have built into your car that doesn't go into the HUD. That's later when you're not currently racing. The things that you care about when you are racing are your speed, what gear you're in, how much laps you've done, how much farther till the end, possibly a rear view mirror, those kind of things that you actually want to know in a car, right? Those are the things that belong in the HUD. Everything else does not belong in the HUD. Sports games, the same thing when actively playing the sports game. So let's say it's FIFA or something. The time that's left, very similar to the same thing that somebody is watching the game. The score, the time, who's got possession, those kind of things. Those are all going to be in the HUD of a sports game. And keep everything else out of it. When the player pauses or when they're going through their choose a play menu or something, that's when it's time to put other stuff in there, not during the active portion of a sports game. Okay, so here are some examples from my last class that we actually did meet in real life, and we drew a racing game HUD. So don't mind my drawing, but some things that we have in here. I've got speedometer down in the bottom left corner, and number of turbos over here, a main menu button down in the lower right hand corner, a mini map in the upper right hand corner with a position icon, which I hadn't mentioned earlier, tells us we're in second place. And we have done 2 out of 3 laps so far. And we put a rear view mirror in there because this is a super fast racing game and we're concerned with with being passed by some other player. And then something we don't always think about is the HUD of a racing game is what down here in the bottom, just to the left, we've drawn the steering wheel. So as you turn left and right, you're going to see the driver's hands and the steering wheel go on there, and it's just going to add that little bit more to this game. It makes you feel like you are the driver. When you make a really fast turn, maybe we can display their hands going hand over hand and turning really fast. That's just going to add a little something to this particular game that other games might not have. Okay, and next I have an RPG style character equipment menu. So we have, in this one, it's a party-based game, so there's 3-4 different players, so we're using L2 and R2 to swap players, which we've listed right above the left-hand side there. L2 and R2 are going to switch from Greg the Mighty to whatever the other player is, okay? And we have to put those things in here. We draw a little picture, draw an icon of the L2 and R2 button, and we say it's L2 and R2 right on there. We don't just put arrows, we actually put L2 and R2, because when the player gets to the menu, if you don't tell them the button is L2 and R2 to swap between players, they're going to go, how do I do that? And they're going to press the wrong button the first time, and they're going to, equip something or unequip something that they didn't want to, and they're not going to be happy. And then they're going to come back and they're going to say, why didn't this game just tell me it was L2 and R2? That's stupid. Why didn't they just tell me that? It's not that hard. Just put it right there on the screen. The same thing with navigating left and right between the gear on one side and the skills on the other side. Something I hadn't mentioned earlier is this is an RPG, so this player has skills or maybe magic spells or whatnot, and so the L1 and R1 are going to swap us between using the gear menu and using the skills menu. And down at the bottom we have some other menu buttons where we can accept our changes, restore what the options were like before. So basically it's a back button for all of our changes. We can press the Y button in this case that we're using an Xbox controller. We can go to the stats menu. So after we've changed some gear options or maybe even learned a new skill or something, we can view our stats and see what the changes are. So before I mentioned that maybe we put an armor rating right where the player is or something. In this particular menu, because we also have the skills, so we have less screen real estate, we're going to just make one of those buttons show us the stats of the player instead. And then we left another button over for an other menu to be determined later. We're still building this game. Yeah. So we have options for yet another menu. Okay. Any questions? Save them for later because this is on YouTube. Okay, so next one I have, hopefully you can see that pretty well. It's just an inventory and we're making it as if we're on a PC. I think the last one was also on a PC. No, the last one was on a console, of course, because I went on and on about the L2 and the R2 button. So this one's on a PC. So we're using the same buttons at the bottom because PC players can use Xbox controllers as well, right? So we're using the same button configuration here, but then everything else on here, we're assuming that they're using a mouse and keyboard. So we're kind of doing two things at once here, but think of it this way, and I do this sometimes as well, like if I'm playing Dark Souls or something, I'm using my controller all the time. But then if I go into the Dark Souls menu, I just use the controller for the normal menu. But if I go into a different type of menu, a more system-related menu, I'm going to pull the mouse out and I'm going to navigate with the mouse as well. I'm not actually going to pull the mouse out. It's already there. But I'll do that. And I do the same thing with Warframe. I don't know if any of you played Warframe. It's a first-person shooter RPG type game or third person. And I use a controller to play that. It's on PC. You use a controller, but when I get into the menus, you got to use the mouse because the menus are more complicated in that game. In our inventory one right here, a little example, we can absolutely use a controller for all of this. We can use up, down, left, and right. We can use the X button for use or equip items. And we make sure that as we're navigating through the tab panes on here, and the players can only equip one chest piece, one leg piece, that kind of thing. So if they equip one, it automatically unequips the other one. We don't have to do anything else. And now we've incorporated the gear, like this previous example. We had our gear over here. In the next one, oh, hey, you know what? We'll just use an inventory thing, and then when somebody clicks on it, boom, it's equipped. Right? That's pretty great, right? They work very well with each other, so I can start with this gear option, even though it's a totally different, one's a console, one's a PC example. If I were to click on the chest piece in here, and then it opens up the menu, and I can navigate around, and maybe you gray out all the inventory items that the player can't use at the moment because they've chosen the chest piece, right? So you gray out all the chest pieces that they can't fit because their stats aren't high enough, and you gray out all the things that are not chest pieces, and then they go in and they just select whichever one or none if they don't have any, you probably also want to include a none option or a default option. Make sure they always have that or something, so that if they don't have any other ones, they have at least something they can pick. And then there's a sell option, or just selling things to the computer gods, I suppose, in this example. Right. Next, usability. All right, I have this little example right here. All right, you've probably seen a game in the past where you message pops up, asks you a question, and you have to select yes or no. Maybe it's let's pretend it's a gold-themed game, so black and gold, and both things are highlighted in gold, but one's a little bit brighter. Which one is currently selected? Maybe that's the one that's a little bit brighter. Maybe it's not. And you don't necessarily know. And when you press left and right, it does like the around the world thing. So if I keep pressing right, it just keeps swapping between the two, and then I'll never know which one is actually chosen until I select one and cross my fingers that it's the correct one. A simple way to fix this, regardless of how it's highlighted, so regardless if the person is colorblind and they can't tell what you've highlighted because you think that it's the perfect color choice, but maybe it's not, doesn't matter. Regardless of that, when the player presses right, the selection goes to the right, and when it gets to the end, it stops. And then when the player presses left, the selection goes to the left. And again, when it gets to the end, it stops. So then the player knows for sure that they're choosing the far left or the far right option. And if there's more than two options, then it's kind of easy. If there's only two options, then they know when it stops, okay, I must be choosing the right option or the left option, and now I can say yes or no, or whatever the options are that's presented to them. But there are a few games in the past that have done this, where pressing right just keeps on toggling over and over and over again, and if the player can't visibly tell which one is selected, then they got a 50-50 chance. They're just guessing, and I hope it's not an important choice for this game. Right? Okay, so don't do that. That's a big no-no. Do the solution. And then some further accessibility notices that I did mention on the previous, because you don't know if a player is going to be colorblind, depending on your game choice or the company who makes your game, who is actually producing your game. They may say you have to absolutely make this game accessible to colorblind people. That's our corporate rules, and you have to do it. So you have to know about color combinations and contrast ratios and that. Definitely have light colors for text and dark colors for the background, or vice versa. That's the easiest way to go for colorblindness, is very high contrast, no matter what the color choice is. If you have high contrast in there between the text and the background behind the text, you're going to be all right there. For visually impaired players, don't put really fine print in there. Okay, make sure your text is average sized or so, so that people don't have to feel like they need to really put their face close to their phone if it's a phone game, or if they have to sit closer to the TV or something. Sit 10 feet away from the screen, because we should all be playing games from 10 feet away. And make sure that you can read it, and make sure you can read it not without your glasses, but you know what I mean. Make sure you don't need any kind of special equipment to be able to read it. An average sighted person, sit 10 feet away from your screen. They should be able to read everything on your screen. If it's a TV-based game, if it's a console-based game, if it's a computer, arm's length away, right? We should be able to reach the keyboard. A relaxed elbow, arm's length away. Make sure you can read everything. And the same thing with a phone. Make sure that it's relaxed. Make sure that you can hold the phone at your belly button and still be able to read it. Right? If you can read things from that distance, if an average person can read things from that distance, that's the right size for your text, for your buttons. The buttons should be bigger than the text at that size. Remember, fat fingers, small buttons, don't mix, right? That's a universal accessibility thing, not just for anybody with any kind of visual or hearing impairment. Speaking of hearing impairment, make sure menu choices, for game purposes, you can absolutely have audible things be important in the game, but make sure that they're not the only cue for certain things. Okay, make sure that there is a visual and an audio cue, if there's an audio cue, because mobile, people turn the volume off a lot when they play games. Any other game, people probably turn their volume up if they're on console or PC or whatnot. Maybe they're wearing headphones or something, but there are people who can't hear, who like to play games, and make sure that you have, if there's an audio cue, make sure there's also a visual cue of some kind to go along with it, so they're not required to be able to hear in order to beat the boss or something, because that's a bad move, right? They're playing some game and they get up to the boss, and wow, if only I could hear, I could beat this boss. Man, would I hate that if I was more hearing impaired than I already am. And last on here, all right, you don't have to just keep all the words out of your game, but try not to use big words unless it's narrative stuff that really belongs in the narrative. But for general instructions of the game, menu type stuff, try to make as simple words as possible, possibly even using simple English, which is about a list of only about 2,000 words or so. You can look that up on Wikipedia or whatever, look up simple English. If you're using only words in simple English, absolutely, everybody who is old enough to play your game should be fine. Unless you're making a preschool game, then absolutely use simple English and then teach them how to read it. That's a totally different game, though. But there are illiterate or semi-literate teenagers and adults who are playing games, and you want your game to be accessible to them so that they can live as close to a normal life as they can, and they can be your customer, even though they can't read big words. So, put big words in the narrative, of course, when it belongs there. Absolutely. But not so much into the menu. Maybe the text, the title of gear and stuff, it can be complex in that, but the directions on how to equip gear, and you're not going to run into this much anyway if you're following my previous examples, which are draw an icon of the button, say that it's L2 and R2 and that kind of stuff. People don't have to be able to read to know what that is, right? The controller has an L2 and an R2. Thing says L2 and R2. They don't have to be able to read. They just match it up. It could be hieroglyphics. Doesn't matter. Okay. That's the last slide. Okay. Thanks for showing up to my YouTube class on interfaces. Don't forget this week's discussion and quiz, and I'll have more information on Blackboard for announcements as to what else to expect for this week and next week. All right. Thanks again. Everyone have a great week. See you next time.